The soup was burning again. I could smell it before I even reached the bottom of the stairs. That particular kind of scorching that meant someone had left the iron pot too close to the fire and walked away. Which meant it would be my job to scrape the bottom clean before the head cook noticed. Which meant I would be standing over a steaming cauldron with a wooden spoon and raw knuckles for the better part of an hour, while everyone else moved on to easier tasks. I didn't mind, really. That was the thing no one ever quite believed about me. I genuinely didn't mind. The kitchens of Veldrath Keep were the only place in this entire fortress where the air felt like it belonged to everyone equally. Outside these walls, there were hierarchies carved into the very stone. Who walked where, who bowed to whom, which hallways were permitted, and which were sealed by rank and blood, and the particular kind of authority that came from being born with something wild living under your skin. In here, the fire didn't care who you were. The bread rose or it didn't. The broth needed salt or it didn't. These were honest truths, and I had always preferred honest truths to the complicated kind. My name was Maisie. I was 23 years old, human, and I had worked in the kitchens of the Alpha King's Keep for 4 years without incident. That was, until this particular Thursday morning in late autumn when I started humming. It wasn't intentional. It never was, with me. A tune had lodged itself behind my sternum sometime in the night. Something my mother used to sing while she braided my hair. A wandering melody without proper words. Just a series of ascending notes that circled back on themselves like a river that couldn't quite decide where to go. I'd woken with it already running through me, and by the time I'd pulled on my gray dress and pinned my pale hair back and descended the 3 flights of service stairs to the kitchen level, the humming had simply begun. I was at the large center table, kneading the second bread batch of the morning. The other kitchen workers moved around me in their usual patterns. Petra at the fire managing the breakfast porridge, old Henwick hauling water from the well corridor, young Dasa sorting dried herbs with the focused expression of someone who had recently been scolded about confusing rosemary and thyme. The song moved through me the way breath does. Natural. Unplanned. I didn't notice the window until Petra made a small, strangled sound. I looked up. There were wolves at the window. Not metaphorically. Not in the way people sometimes use that phrase to mean powerful men watching. Actual wolves. Massive. Silver gray and charcoal, and one the color of winter fog, standing at the long kitchen window that faced the inner courtyard, their breath fogging the cold glass, their yellow eyes fixed on me with an attention so complete and so still that it turned the air in the room into something different. Something held. Petra had gone the color of old linen. Dasa had stopped sorting entirely, her hands frozen above the herb bundles. Henwick, who had been alive long enough to have seen most things, set down his water bucket with extraordinary care and took 3 slow steps backward toward the far wall. I stopped humming. The largest wolf, the one the color of winter fog, with a scar that ran from his left eye down across his muzzle, tilted his head, just slightly, just enough to make me feel like I had interrupted something he had been listening to very closely. "Maisie," Petra said, in a voice that was barely a voice at all. "Don't move." "I'm not moving," I said. "Don't breathe," she amended. "That's less practical," I said. The fog-colored wolf exhaled slowly. His breath made a long cloud on the glass. The others held their positions. I counted 5 of them now, though 2 more had appeared at the far edge of the window while I'd been cataloging the first 3. And there was something about the arrangement of their bodies that tugged at the back of my mind. They weren't pressing against the glass. They weren't snarling or pawing or performing any of the threatening behaviors I had been quietly warned about in my first week working here. They were simply watching, like an audience. Like they were waiting for me to continue. I am not a brave person by anyone's definition, including my own. I am practical, which is sometimes mistaken for bravery, but is actually just a deep and abiding belief that panicking rarely improves a situation. My hands were still pressed into the bread dough. The dough still needed kneading. The bread still needed to rise before the midday meal. So I looked at the wolves at the window, all 7 of them now, shoulder to shoulder in the thin autumn light, and I began to hum again. The reaction was immediate, and it was unlike anything I had the vocabulary to describe. The largest wolf closed his eyes. The others settled, some lowering their heads, some shifting their weight. One of the smaller ones lying down directly beneath the window with his nose pointed toward the glass as if he could absorb the sound better from that angle. None of them moved away. None of them became more agitated. They simply settled, the way a room settles when someone finally opens a window and lets in the right amount of air. Petra made a second sound. This one was different from the first. Less fear, more bewilderment. I kept kneading. I kept humming. The melody my mother had given me moved through the kitchen and apparently through the glass, and apparently into whatever it was that wolves experienced when they stood in cold courtyards and listened to human girls work. When the tune finally ended, when it circled back on itself one last time and resolved into quiet, the fog-colored wolf opened his eyes. He looked at me for a long moment. Then, with a deliberateness that felt almost formal, he turned and walked away from the window. The others followed. The courtyard was empty. The kitchen was silent except for the crackling of the fire and the sound of my own breathing, and Petra saying very quietly, "That was the king's wolves." I pressed my palms flat against the bread dough. "I know," I said. "The Alpha King's personal guard doesn't come to the kitchen window," she said. "They don't come to the kitchen at all. They're not supposed to." "I know," I said again. What I didn't say, what I couldn't quite bring myself to say, was that the fog-colored wolf had looked at me the way you look at something you recognize from a long way off. The way you look at something you have been searching for long enough that finding it produces not joy, but a kind of exhale, a relieved and exhausted recognition. The bread needed to finish rising. The scorched soup needed scraping. There were still 4 hours until the midday meal, and a dozen tasks between now and then that required my hands and my attention and my complete and practical focus. I told myself this firmly. I told myself this while my heart continued to behave in a manner I had no patience for, knocking against my ribs like it was trying to tell me something I hadn't asked to know. By the time Henwick finally retrieved his water bucket from the corner where he had set it down, and Dasa returned to her herbs with trembling hands, and Petra poured herself a cup of something strong from the shelf above the fire. By that time, the courtyard outside the window had been empty for a full 10 minutes, but I could still feel those yellow eyes, the fog-colored wolf, the largest one, the one with the scar. I had been at Veldrath Keep for 4 years. I had cleaned and cooked and scrubbed and kept my head down, and existed in the margins of this place, the way humans learn to exist in the margins of everything that belonged to wolves. I had never, in 4 years, seen the Alpha King. But I had heard enough, from enough people, in enough midnight kitchen conversations to know one thing with certainty. His eyes were yellow, and the scar on his face ran from the left eye down. The news traveled the way news always traveled in Veldrath Keep, not through official channels, not through announcements or messengers or any of the formal systems that existed for exactly that purpose, but through whispers moving mouth to ear across hallways and stairwells and the narrow spaces between bodies working in close quarters. By afternoon, everyone in the service quarters knew. By evening, the version had already mutated into something larger than what had actually happened. I heard 3 different accounts of my own morning before supper, each one slightly more dramatic than the last. In the first version, I had sung an ancient binding song and the wolves had been unable to move. In the second, I had pressed my hand to the glass and one of the wolves had pressed his paw back. In the third, and this was the version Dasa was clearly responsible for, based on her propensity for embellishment, I had opened the window and fed them from my hand. None of these things had happened. What had happened was quieter and stranger, and somehow more unsettling than any of them. I ate my supper at the long kitchen table with my head down, and said nothing to correct any version of the story, because correcting stories required engaging with them, and engaging with them required acknowledging that something had happened that I didn't yet have a framework for understanding. Practical people wait for frameworks before they engage. That is, more or less, my entire philosophy of survival. Petra sat across from me and watched me eat, with an expression I recognized as worry, wearing a thin disguise of neutrality. "Head cook wants to speak with you in the morning," she said. I looked up from my bread. "About the wolves?" "About your schedule," she said carefully. "She's moving you to the outer kitchen, the one that faces away from the courtyard." I understood what that meant. It meant that someone had decided the simplest solution to whatever had occurred this morning was to relocate the variable, meaning me, to a position where it couldn't repeat itself. Move the human girl who made the king's wolves stop and stare to a room without windows facing the spaces those wolves occupied. "All right," I said. Petra's careful expression flickered. "You're not going to argue?" "Would arguing change it?" "No," she admitted. "Then all right," I said again, and returned to my bread. But I lay awake that night in my narrow bed in the service dormitory, listening to the wind move through the stones of the keep, and I thought about the fog-colored wolf closing his eyes, the way the others had settled around him, the particular quality of stillness that had come over all of them, not the stillness of predators waiting to strike, which I had seen once, from a distance, during a territorial crossing, when I was still new here, and didn't yet know all the rules about where not to stand. This had been a different kind of stillness entirely, the stillness of rest, of something that had been wound tight for a long time, briefly loosening. I had grown up in a border town, one of those small, practical places that existed at the edges of wolf territory and human territory both, belonging fully to neither, which meant growing up learning to read the moods of creatures who could level a building if they chose to. My mother had taught me that wolves, in their shifted form, responded to sound the way humans responded to light. It entered them differently, more completely, bypassing whatever filters the thinking mind normally employed. A bad sound could drive them toward aggression. A good sound could reach something underneath the aggression entirely. She had also told me, with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who had lived beside these territories her whole life, that a human who could produce a sound that affected a wolf in their shifted form was either very fortunate or very endangered, and that the difference between the two categories was almost entirely a matter of who noticed first and what they decided to do about it. I had not, until this morning, understood this as something that applied to me personally. I reported to the outer kitchen the next morning without comment, and spent the day in a room that smelled of old grease and received very little light, and was staffed primarily by two older men named Corvin and Bram, who communicated with each other almost exclusively through a series of grunts I spent the first several hours attempting to decode. It was duller work, more repetitive, the kind of tasks that got assigned to either the newest workers or the ones someone wanted to keep occupied and unnoticed. I did them without complaint. I did not hum. On the second day, one of the senior household staff, a tall woman named Renna, who managed the upper-floor domestic arrangements, and who had always struck me as someone who had survived this place by being irreplaceable, came to the outer kitchen doorway and stood there for a moment without speaking. Corvin and Bram both stopped working. That was notable. Almost nothing made them stop working. "Maisie," Renna said, not a question, just my name, spoken with the particular precision of someone confirming a location. "Yes," I said. "Come with me." I looked at my hands, which were deep in a vegetable preparation that was approximately 40 minutes from being complete. "I'm in the middle of—" "Corvin will finish," Renna said. Corvin made a grunt that I had by this point tentatively identified as agreement. I washed my hands. I followed Renna. She led me through corridors I had technically been permitted to walk, but had rarely used. The middle floors of the keep, where the administrative functions lived, where the household managers and senior staff operated in a world more formal than the kitchen levels, but less rarefied than whatever existed above. We walked without speaking. Rena had the posture of someone who had trained herself never to look behind her, which told me she was either supremely confident or supremely practiced at appearing that way. We stopped in front of a door I didn't recognize. "You've been reassigned," Rena said, effective immediately. I looked at the door. "To what?" "Upper hall maintenance, morning rotation." She paused, with the slight hesitation of someone choosing words from a larger selection. "You will be working near the Eastern Corridor. You'll follow the standard protocols. You will not initiate contact. You will not draw attention to yourself." None of this told me anything concrete, which told me everything relevant. "The wolves told him," I said. Rena looked at me the way people look at you when you've said something accurate that they were hoping you wouldn't say. "Your duties begin tomorrow at first light. I'll send someone to show you the rotation." She walked away. I stood in front of the unfamiliar door and breathed through the thing that was happening in my chest. Not quite fear, not quite excitement, something occupying the uncomfortable territory between them that had no clean name. Upper hall maintenance, Eastern Corridor. The Eastern Corridor, in the geography of Veldrath Keep that I had assembled over 4 years of careful peripheral observation, was the corridor that ran alongside the Alpha King's private wing. I was not a brave person. I was practical. And practically speaking, I understood that I had no meaningful choice here, that the choice had already been made somewhere above me, in rooms I had no access to, by people operating on information and motivations I couldn't fully see. The variable had been noticed. The variable was being repositioned. The only question that remained was what happened next. I thought about fog-colored eyes, about 7 wolves standing shoulder to shoulder in cold morning light, listening to a human girl knead bread dough and hum her mother's song. I thought about what my mother had said, in that border town, in that practical voice she used for truths she considered important. A sound that can reach something underneath the aggression entirely. That's not a small thing, Maisie. That's not nothing. I had been 20 years old when she'd said it, and I hadn't known she was talking about me. I thought I might be beginning to understand it now. Down the corridor, somewhere above and ahead, a door opened and closed. Footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. The sound of the keep doing what it always did, holding all its contained lives inside its stones, pressing them up against each other in the dark. I turned and walked back toward the kitchen level. Tomorrow, the Eastern Corridor. Tonight, sleep, if I could find it. The Eastern Corridor smelled like cedar and cold stone, and something underneath both of those things that I didn't have a name for yet. Something that registered not quite as a scent, but as a pressure, a density in the air. The way a room feels different when something large has recently passed through it. I learned this on my first morning. I also learned that the Eastern Corridor was longer than it appeared on the mental map I had constructed from years of second-hand descriptions, that the windows along its north wall let in a particular quality of gray autumn light that turned everything it touched slightly silver, and that the 2 wolves assigned to stand at the far end, in their human forms, dressed in the dark practical clothing of the king's personal guard, watched every person who entered with a quality of attention that made me feel simultaneously very seen and very small. I kept my eyes on the floor. I kept my hands busy. I followed the rotation, the windows first, then the floor, then the alcoves where decorative objects gathered dust in arrangements that suggested they had not been meaningfully looked at in years. I did not hum. 3 days passed like this, quiet, careful, unremarkable. I began to believe that perhaps the reassignment was exactly what Rena had described it as, a change of duties, nothing more, motivated by the kind of administrative reshuffling that happened in large households without dramatic reason. On the 4th morning, I was cleaning the 3rd window from the north end, when the door at the far end of the corridor opened. I knew before I looked up. The pressure in the air changed. The 2 guards, who had maintained their stillness with professional consistency for 3 days, shifted. Not much, not visibly to anyone who hadn't been watching them carefully, but enough. A minute adjustment of posture, a slight reorientation of attention. I kept my cloth moving on the glass. I heard footsteps, even, measured, unhurried. The footsteps of someone who had never needed to hurry because the world reliably arranged itself around their pace. I was aware, with a clarity that was almost inconvenient, that I was holding my breath. He stopped. I knew he stopped because the sound stopped, and because the quality of attention in the corridor, which had already been considerable, intensified into something that had actual weight. I finished the section of window I was working on. I moved the cloth to the next section. My hands were steady, which surprised me, because the rest of me was doing something complicated and involuntary. "You're the one from the kitchen." His voice was low, not unkind, not warm exactly, more like a temperature that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. I turned. The first thing I registered was the scar, because I had been thinking about it for days, had built a kind of mental preparation around it, and seeing it in reality was different from the version I'd constructed. It ran from the outer corner of his left eye down across the plane of his cheekbone in a line that was almost precise, almost deliberate looking, the kind of mark that on a lesser face might have seemed a flaw, and on this face seemed instead like punctuation, like the world had underlined something. The second thing I registered was that he was looking at me the way the fog-colored wolf had looked at me through the kitchen window, with that exhausted, recognizing quality. With that particular expression of someone who had found something they weren't entirely sure they'd been searching for. Adrian, Alpha King of Veldrath and the 6 surrounding territories, was perhaps 30 years old and carried himself like someone who had been required to be certain about things from a very young age, and had learned certainty so thoroughly that it had become indistinguishable from his actual self. He was not, I noted with the detached practicality I was using to keep myself functional, what I had imagined from Kitchen Whispers. Kitchen Whispers had made him enormous and terrible and cold, in a way that suggested the cold was intentional, weaponized, aimed. He was simply very present. That was the most accurate word I had. Present in a way that made the corridor feel smaller, not because of size or threat, but because of attention. All of it directed, currently, at me. "Yes," I said. "I apologize if it caused a disruption." Something moved through his expression. Not quite amusement. More like surprise. The way you look surprised when something does the unexpected thing of being exactly what it appears to be. "A disruption," he repeated. "The wolves gathering at the window. I didn't intend it. I wasn't aware." I stopped, reorganized. "I apologize." "You apologize for my wolves choosing where to stand?" "I apologize for whatever it was that made them choose it. I understand it was irregular." He was quiet for a moment. The 2 guards at the end of the corridor had achieved a stillness so complete, they had essentially ceased to exist as variables in the room. "Do you know what you were humming?" he asked. The question was unexpected enough that I answered it honestly before I could decide whether honesty was strategic. "A song my mother sang. It doesn't have words. She learned it from her mother, who lived near the northern borders her whole life. Near the Greywood territory." "Not a question." He said it the way you say the name of a place you know well. "I think so," I said. She never specified. "The Greywood pack used that melody as a settling call," he said, "for young wolves who couldn't control the shift yet, for wolves in distress." He paused. "It's not a human song." I absorbed this. "My mother didn't know that," I said. "Or if she did, she didn't say." "No," he said. "She likely didn't know." Another pause, longer. "It hasn't been used in 40 years. The Greywood pack is gone." The word "gone" sat in the space between us with the weight of something that was not a simple word at all. I thought about the fog-colored wolf closing his eyes, the particular quality of that settling, Not peace exactly, but the shape of where peace had once lived and might, briefly, be approximated again. I thought about 7 wolves standing in cold morning light to listen to something that belonged to a pack that no longer existed. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it differently than I had meant my earlier apology. He looked at me for a long moment. Something in his face had shifted. Not much, and not in a way I could have pointed to and named, but the certainty that he wore like a second skin had developed something underneath it, a texture, like the surface of still water when something moves below. "Don't stop," he said. I blinked. "Sir? Humming. Don't stop." He said it plainly, as if it were an administrative directive, and not one of the stranger things anyone had said to me in 4 years of working in this keep. "You were reassigned to this corridor. Complete your work as assigned." He moved to pass me. He stopped again just briefly when he was level with me, close enough that the cedar and pressure scent was very clear, close enough that I was aware of the fact that I came up to approximately his shoulder. "What's your name?" he asked. "Maisie," I said. He nodded once, as if filing it somewhere. Then he continued down the corridor and through the door at the far end, and the guards resumed their breathing, and the silver morning light came through the windows and lay itself across the stone floor in long, pale rectangles, and I stood holding my cleaning cloth with my heart doing something I had no patience for, and my mind working very fast on very little information. The Greywood pack. Gone, he'd said. And his wolves. His wolves who had been young once, who had been in distress once, who had perhaps needed a settling call and found no one left to give it, had heard something in a kitchen window and come to stand in the cold and listen. I turned back to the window. I began very quietly to hum. From somewhere behind the door at the far end of the corridor, from somewhere in the wing that no human member of the household staff had ever been permitted to enter, I heard, or thought I heard, or perhaps only felt through the soles of my feet and the palms of my hands pressed against cold glass, the keep itself exhaling. Weeks passed. This is the part that surprised me most. Not that something had begun, but how quietly it began. How it built itself out of small repeated things rather than dramatic gestures. How it looked, from the outside, almost exactly like nothing. Every morning I came to the eastern corridor at first light. Every morning I worked through the rotation. Windows, floor, alcoves. The long stretch of paneled wall near the north end that collected dust in its carved grooves with particular dedication. Every morning, at some point between the second and third window, I began to hum. And every morning, within perhaps 10 minutes of that, the door at the far end opened. He never came to speak to me directly again. Not at first. He would pass through the corridor on his way to whatever the day required of an Alpha King. Meetings, I assumed. Decisions. The management of territories and alliances, and the 1,000 invisible pressures that kept something as large and complicated as Veldrath functioning. He walked with the same measured pace. He nodded once when he passed me. I nodded back. This was, I understood, not nothing. Rena confirmed this for me indirectly. About 2 weeks in, when she appeared at my dormitory door in the evening, with the expression of someone who had been asked to deliver information they didn't fully understand. "The King's steward came to me today," she said. "All right," I said. "He asked about your background, your family, where you came from." She paused. "Your contract status." Contract status meant whether I was bound to the household or whether I was here by choice. A distinction that mattered in wolf territories, where humans occupied a specific legal category that was either protected or precarious, depending on which side of which line you fell. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you came from a border settlement, that you've been here 4 years without incident, that your contract is standard renewable." She looked at me with the directness of someone who had earned the right to ask direct questions. "Maisie, what happened in that corridor?" "He asked me about the song," I said, "about where it came from. And he told me it belonged to the Greywood pack." Rena went very still in the way that people who knew old histories went still when those histories surfaced unexpectedly. "The Greywood Pack," she said carefully. "You know about them. Everyone who has been here long enough knows about them." She sat down on the edge of the small chair by my door, with the deliberateness of someone rearranging their understanding of a situation. Adrian was fostered with the Greywood Pack as a child, when the Alpha King before him, his father, was managing the eastern border conflicts. He was there for 3 years. He was 7 years old when the pack... She stopped, chose a different word. When they were lost. 7 years old. I thought about a child in a strange pack, learning the particular safety of belonging somewhere, being given a settling call the way you're given a song for sleeping. I thought about carrying that for 20-something years in a world where the thing that had given it to you no longer existed. "His wolves," I said slowly. "The ones who came to the window. Were any of them—" "Ronan," Rena said. "The large gray one. He was Greywood born. He was a pup when it happened. Adrian brought him here when he assumed the kingship." She paused. "He's been the king's closest guard for 11 years. The fog-colored wolf, the one who had closed his eyes." I pressed my hands flat against my knees and breathed through something that was trying to become larger than I had space for. "I'm not trying to cause difficulty," I said. "I know that," Rena said. "I also know that difficulty has a way of finding certain people regardless of their intentions." She stood. "Just be careful, Maisie. Not frightened. Careful. There's a difference." She left. I sat with the difference for a long time. It was Ronan who approached me first, in his human form. On a gray Tuesday morning when the corridor was emptier than usual, and the light through the windows was the color of unpolished silver. He was tall in this form, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped dark hair, and the kind of face that communicated a great deal through very small movements. The scar on his muzzle translated in this form to a faint line along his jaw that most people probably didn't notice unless they were looking for it. I was looking for it. He stopped a few feet from me with the careful distance of someone who understood that proximity was a thing to be managed and was managing it deliberately. "You knew the call," he said, not accusatory, wondering. "My mother taught me the melody," I said. "She didn't know what it was." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression, something old and complicated that I recognized as grief, not because I knew his grief specifically, but because grief has a particular quality, regardless of whose it is. "I haven't heard it since I was small," he said. "None of us have." "I'm sorry," I said. For the 3rd time in this keep, I meant it as something more than courtesy. He nodded. Then, with the directness that I was beginning to recognize as characteristic of wolves who trusted you enough to dispense with indirection, "He doesn't sleep well." I looked at him. "He hasn't for years," Ronan continued, "since before I can remember clearly. There are things that help for a time, and then stop helping. There are things that make it worse." He paused. "Since you came to this corridor, he has slept." I didn't know what to do with this information, so I held it carefully and said nothing. "I'm not telling you this to create obligation," Ronan said quickly, reading something in my silence. "I'm telling you because you should understand what you've done. Not what you might do. What you've already done." I thought about that. "He told me not to stop humming," I said. "Yes," Ronan said. "He did. Is that an order?" Formally. Something that was almost a smile moved through Ronan's expression. With him, the difference between an order and a request is usually that one of them comes with a please. He doesn't use please very often, but it doesn't always mean what you'd think. He excused himself with a slight nod and walked back toward the far end of the corridor. I stood with my cleaning cloth and the silver light and the new, complicated weight of what I was beginning to understand. The first time Adrian stopped to speak to me properly, not passing, not directive, but actually stopped and stood and looked at me like a person looking at another person rather than a variable being assessed. It was raining. The kind of heavy, gray autumn rain that made the keep feel smaller and closer and turned the sound of the world outside into white noise. I had been humming something slightly different that morning, a variation on the melody, something I'd invented somewhere in the weeks of repetition, a branch that grew from the original tune and went somewhere new. He stopped in the middle of the corridor and said, "That's different." "It's the same bass," I said. "Just extended. I hope that's all right." "Where does it go?" I blinked. "I'm not sure yet. I've been finding it as I go." And he looked at me with an expression I was learning to read, the way the surface of him shifted when something had reached underneath the certainty to whatever lived below it. It happened rarely. I was beginning to understand that it was significant when it did. "My father," he said, "believed that wolves who needed a settling call were weak, that the Greywood Pack's use of it was a sign of poor discipline. He said it plainly. No self-pity, no invitation for comfort. Just a fact, delivered with the same evenness he used for everything." "Your father was wrong," I said. The words were out before I could consider them. The practical part of my brain registered, briefly, that I had just disagreed with the Alpha King about his father, in his corridor, while holding a cleaning cloth. He looked at me for a long moment. "Yes," he said. He was. The rain hit the windows. The corridor breathed around us. Something that had been held at a careful distance for weeks shifted, slightly, incrementally, like a door that has been unlocked but not yet opened. He didn't move to leave. Neither did I. "Tell me about your border town," he said. And so I did. Winter came to Veldrath Keep the way it always did, not gradually but decisively, as if the cold had been waiting just beyond the tree line for permission and finally received it. The courtyard filled with frost, the corridor windows fogged from the inside each morning, and I would arrive to find my breath already visible before I'd taken 3 steps into the hallway, the silver light replaced by something whiter and more absolute. I had been on the Eastern Corridor rotation for 2 months. In those 2 months, several things had become true. The first was that Adrian and I spoke every morning. Not always for long, sometimes only a few exchanged sentences before the day's demands pulled him away, but consistently, with the reliability of something that had become structural rather than incidental. He asked questions the way someone asks questions when they have spent a long time not asking them. Carefully, as if testing whether the ground would hold, I answered honestly, because honesty was the only mode I had ever been comfortable in, and because something about the way he listened made dishonesty feel not just wrong, but somehow impossible, like trying to hum a false note. The second was that his wolves had stopped maintaining formal distance. It happened gradually. Ronan first, who had already spoken to me, and who began to linger at the corridor's edge on the mornings he was assigned to it, occasionally offering a word or two before resuming his watch. Then the others, slowly, one by one. Kale, who was youngest and most openly curious, and kept asking about border town markets with the enthusiasm of someone who had never been permitted to be openly enthusiastic about anything. Davin, who was quiet in a way that was different from Adrian's quiet, softer at the edges, who once helped me move a heavy decorative shelf without being asked, and then walked away before I could thank him. Isra, the only woman among the guard, who watched me for 3 full weeks before she finally said, during a moment when we were briefly alone in the corridor, "You don't perform," as if this were a remarkable quality she had taken time to verify. I didn't know what to say to that. "I don't know how to perform," I said. "I never learned." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." And that seemed to settle something for her. because after that she treated me with the straightforward, unornamented respect that I was learning was how wolves treated people they had decided to trust. The third thing that had become true was harder to name, and so I had been avoiding naming it. The council arrived on a Wednesday. I learned about this the way I learned most things, through the kitchen, through Petra's voice in the corridor outside the outer kitchen where I still sometimes helped in the afternoons, tight with the particular anxiety of someone who understood that certain visitors meant certain complications. 3 representatives from the Eastern Alliance territories, 2 from the Northern Border Councils. They were here, the whisper said, about the question of the king's formal bonding, the political alliance that would be sealed through a pairing with the daughter of the Aldenvast Pack, a young woman named Cora, who had by all accounts been prepared for this role since she was a child. This was not new information exactly. The bonding negotiation had been discussed in the keep's lower floors for years as a distant, theoretical thing. The kind of arrangement that everyone understood was coming without anyone treating it as imminent. It was, apparently, now imminent. I carried this information carefully for 2 days and behaved exactly as I always behaved, and said nothing to anyone, and told myself with some firmness that I had always understood the shape of this situation, and that understanding it had not changed. On the 3rd morning after the council's arrival, Adrian was late to the corridor. When he came, he walked differently. The measured pace was the same, but the quality underneath it had changed. Something compressed. Something that had been given no outlet, and was being managed through the simple application of continued forward motion. He stopped when he saw me. I had already been humming. The variation I had been developing for weeks, the branch that grew from the Greywood melody and went somewhere new, somewhere that was no longer entirely borrowed, but had become partially mine. I didn't stop when he entered. I had learned that stopping was the wrong instinct, that the music was more useful than my anxiety about it. He stood in the middle of the corridor and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "They want an answer by the end of the week." I kept my hands moving on the window. "I know. The whole keep knows." "What does the whole keep think?" "That it's a practical alliance," I said. "Good territorial terms, stable bloodlines." I paused. "That you should accept." "And what do you think?" I stopped, turned to look at him. He was watching me with that expression, the one where the certainty developed a texture underneath it, where something that lived below the surface came close enough to be visible. But there was something else in it now. Something that had the quality of a question being asked in a room where the asker wasn't sure they wanted an honest answer, and had decided to ask anyway. I thought about practicality, about the 4 years I had spent being practical in the margins of this place, about my mother's voice and the Greywood melody, and Ronan closing his eyes, and Isra saying you don't perform, and Adrian asking about my border town with the focused attention of someone who had been hungry for something ordinary for a very long time. "I think," I said carefully, "that practical alliances are valuable. I also think that you've been sleeping, these past 2 months, in a way you apparently weren't sleeping before, and I think those 2 things should both be considered." The corridor was very quiet. "If I accept the council's terms," he said slowly, "you would return to the kitchens." "I would return to the kitchens," I agreed, "and the mornings would stop." Not a question. "Yes," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he walked to the window I had been cleaning and stood beside it. Not quite beside me, but close enough that the cedar and pressure warmth of him was present, and looked out at the white winter courtyard below. "I spent 3 years with the Greywood Pack," he said. "When I came back, my father told me to forget it. That attachment to a lost thing was a weakness." He paused. "I spent 20 years trying to do what he said." I said nothing. I had learned that his silences were working silences, that words were still being sorted, and that filling them was the wrong impulse. "I don't want to spend another 20 years doing what he said," he said. He turned from the window. He looked at me with the directness that had been building for 2 months. Through corridor mornings and rain conversations and the careful geography of 2 people circling something they had both been pretending not to see. "I'm going to tell the council that the Aldenvast negotiation is closed," he said. "That is my decision and my authority, and I've made it." A beat. "What I have not decided is what comes after that. I'm not asking you for anything you haven't offered. I'm not assuming." "I know," I said. "But I would like," he said, with the particular carefulness of someone choosing each word from a very deliberate place, "for the mornings to continue." "The mornings will continue," I said. Something in his face shifted completely. Not dramatically, not in the way that would make a good story, but in the way of something deeply held finally setting down a weight it had been carrying for a very long time. The certainty was still there. It would always be there. It was too thoroughly his to disappear. But underneath it, visible now, was something that had been waiting behind it for years. Relief. Simple, exhausted relief. Spring came. The keep changed with it. Not just the temperature, but the quality of its air, something looser and more open moving through the stone corridors where only cold had been for months. I was still on the eastern corridor rotation. I would be, I understood now, for as long as I chose to be, which Rena had communicated to me with the brisk efficiency she used for all important information, along with a slight softening around her eyes that was, for her, the equivalent of a significant emotional declaration. Ronan had, quietly and without announcement, begun including me in the informal evening gatherings of the Guard, the ones held in the lower east room where the formality of the day dissolved, and people became themselves rather than their functions. Cale talked too much, and Davin listened, and Isra occasionally said something so precisely accurate that it temporarily silenced everyone. I sat among them and felt, with a steadiness that was different from the careful, peripheral steadiness I had cultivated for 4 years, that I was somewhere I was supposed to be. The council had accepted Adrian's decision with the specific displeasure of people who understood that displeasure was all they were permitted. The Aldenvast negotiation was closed. New terms were being drawn with the Eastern Territories on different grounds. Trade agreements, border protocols, arrangements that did not require a person to be the currency of alliance. Adrian had made this clear with the even, certain voice he used for things that were not open to further discussion. On a morning in early spring, pale green light coming through the corridor windows for the first time, he came through the far door and stopped beside the third window, the one that had become, through the accumulation of 200 mornings, the place where things were said between us that didn't get said anywhere else. "Maisie," he said. "Adrian," I said. We had arrived at first names through the same gradual process as everything else, incrementally, without announcement, until one morning it had simply been true. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the courtyard below where the frost had finally, genuinely retreated, and the stones were their own color again. "My father was wrong about a great many things," he said. "I've spent years correcting them one by one." He paused. "I'm trying to determine whether I've been wrong about the same things or different ones." "Both, probably," I said. "That's usually how it works with fathers and sons." He looked at me sideways. The almost smile that lived at the edge of his expression, the one I had learned to watch for, the one that appeared only in specific conditions involving honesty or absurdity, made its appearance briefly. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as staff, not as a function." He turned from the window, as someone who stays because they choose to. I looked at him. This man who had spent 20 years trying to forget a melody, and had instead carried it in his wolves and his silences, and the sleepless architecture of his nights. This man who was asking me for the ordinary thing with the same directness he applied to everything, and who had no guarantee I would say yes, and had decided to ask anyway. I thought about my border town, about my mother's voice. about the way a song can travel through time in the body of someone who doesn't know what it is, arriving exactly where it was needed, exactly when it was needed, without anyone having planned it. "I choose to," I said. The spring light came through the windows and lay itself across the floor in long, warm rectangles. And Ronan, who had been standing at the far end of the corridor, pretending with great dedication not to be listening, made a sound that he would later describe as clearing his throat and that everyone present understood was something else entirely. This is how it ended, and how it began, and how it simply continued. The keep held us all inside its stones the way it always had. But the air in the eastern corridor, from that spring morning onward, was different. Not the dense pressured air of something large and wound tight. Something open. Something that had, after a very long time, found the particular sound it had been missing. Every morning, pale light through old windows. Every morning, the melody, the graywood call, and the variation. And the new branches that grew from both of them season by season, notes added and adjusted, and made into something that had never existed before. Every morning, the door at the far end opening. And the wolves, and the king, and the girl from the border town who never learned to perform, all of them, finally, exactly where they were supposed to be.